Hello and welcome, and in today's video I'm going to show you the top 10 most undervalued Ark Tames. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. In at number 10 we have got the Megalodon, and this creature is here just simply because, like, I find with ocean creatures people go for basilos and creatures like that, and maybe Mosas in the case of some bosses, and I feel like, you know, it's a bit undervalued in that sense because, like, you know, it's the Megalodon. You would think that people will be taming this tons and tons, and they'd just be taming these things all over the place. But actually, from experience, people don't really tame these things that much. And I think that's a little bit of an undervaluement, if you will, because, you know, these creatures are actually pretty decent, and they deal the bleed ability. And yeah, maybe they're not as strong as something like a Mosa. I still find they are quite useful for just general underwater travel. And it's partly because I have a bias to Megalodons, because I'm not really a hater of these things. I love these things. I've been taming these things for years and years now, and obviously I'm going to be biased towards the creatures on this list, but I just find it's undervalued, and I feel like people should be taming this creature more, as I don't think it gets what it deserves, really.
So just to pause the video briefly, I do really need to talk about my Patreon, which you can find on Patreon. Of course, it is going to really add to your experience with this channel. At least it is, in my opinion, purely because the Patreon has way more content out there for you to experience, and you get all of the big videos, and the channel's going towards bigger videos now a week early. So there's a video already out on the Patreon, which is why Ark is Ark worth it in 2024. I'll put it on screen now, and if you want to see it, then you can only see it on Patreon, or you can become a YouTube member. But I think Patreon is going to be the right choice for you. So if you really feel like you want to join the Patreon, then join. We've already got a couple of members there already, and I hope you're going to be the next.
Next up, we have got the Baronics, and this creature is here just because the Barry is one of those tames where I find they're so useful for doing caving, and people these days don't really use them that much, and I kind of feel like that's a shame, really. These creatures are just so nicely and heavily used, or at least they were heavily used back in the day, and it seems like there's been a bit of a drop off with these things, and people tend to talk about them less and less. And yes, they're not the newest creatures out there, and maybe there are some other creatures which you might prefer for doing caving. That's perfectly acceptable, but I think people should still be taming these things and using these things. And I'm not saying like no one tames these things and that's a shame. I'm saying like people should tame these things more and experience them more, as loads of people actually just go caving on foot and they don't even bring a creature in, and they end up just dying loads of times. Like in cases like that, a Baronic can be really useful, especially considering on ASA at the moment you haven't got shadow mains and things like that, and you know they're so useful for that I find they really should be tamed more, and I think that they definitely do deserve more as creatures. It makes sense to tame them, but people these days are being a little bit more skimpish with them. Now, I also did want to put the Mosa here as well. I did talk about earlier how, like, yeah, Mosas are stronger than Megalodons. They definitely are, but I find that these creatures are in some ways even more undervalued, and they definitely do need a lot more work than the Megalodon to become some really great creatures. And obviously you got the X-Mosas and X-Megs on Gen 1, but still, the Mosa these days actually isn't as used as much as you might think. It's not really used at all. Maybe you might use it for the Moda boss fights, but I find Spinos are commonly used in the case instead of Mosas for that, although people have obviously used Mosas for it. But now with loads of new sea creatures out with like mods and all of that, the Mosa just seems very basic and in a lot of ways not really worth taming, and I think that's a bit of a shame. They definitely could do some TLC, especially for the Mosa over the Megalodon. And yeah, like, the people just don't tame them as much as they used to, and you know, they're supposed to kind of be the kings of the ocean, so in that sense it is quite a shame. In at number 7 we have got the Carb Enemies, and this creature is here just simply because, like, you know, it's so commonly just basically used as bait, essentially, in a way. Not exactly bait, but people just use these things to get loads of keratin out of them, and I find that actually as a tame creature they're pretty decent. And yes, maybe they're not the fastest in the world. This does have some increased speed, if you're wondering, by the way, because they are a lot slower than this usually. They're actually pretty decent at swimming in the water, and they're not the slowest things in the world, and give you a good introduction to that. You also, just as a general creature, they're just nice to have it's useful to have a Carb Enemies. And yes, maybe they're not essential. I find if maybe they got a little bit of TLC, they really could be some great creatures which people use, like the Trike and the Stego. It could go to that extent if Wildcard gave these things a little bit more thoughts, because they're not really thought of commonly just as a general thing. You just think Carb Enemies is like, oh, the source of keratin, and that's kind of all you think of them. But if you think of them as a tame and actually try and get some use out of them, you'll find that these creatures are actually pretty decent as just a general underwater creature in the early stages of the game. And I definitely do use them for that quite a bit. And although, yes, again, the speed is not the best, that is not going to be your main concern, especially in the early stages of the game. You just want those creatures that can actually just enable you to do those things. You're not really in a position where you want the best creatures out there, because you're not far enough in the game yet. Next up, we have got the Quetzal, and this creature is here because I found in the 2015, 2016, wherever the Quetzal was released, I think it was late 2015, but it might have been to 2016. Again, not too sure on that, but either way, in those early stages of Ark, when the Quetzal came out, it was really just used so widely. It was such a cool creature, and although very difficult to tame, with that platform saddle on it, it really did make all the difference. And when the flyer speed leveling and all of that got nerfed, there was just a massive decline in Quetzals, as you know, they're not the fastest out there, and also there were just some other creatures came out that people might like to use more, and that's kind of where the Quetzals had a bit of a downfall. And nowadays the Quetzal isn't tamed all too much, at least not as much as I think it should. And yes, I definitely could say this creature could use some TLC just to buff it up a little bit, but also I kind of just prefer Ark with flyer speed leveling. I also do want to know your opinions. Are you pro flyer speed leveling, or are you against flyer speed leveling? Because I'm definitely very much for it. In at number 5, we've got the Caro, and I put this creature here as just people seem to dismiss the Caro for something like an aloe, and although yes, that is objectively a better creature, I find that the Caro can be just extremely useful as quite an early on carnivore. You don't even need that saddle yet, and if you're on ASA, saddles are very easy to come by in drops, and also you can just kill an adult one, and then if it has a baby one attached to it, it's just such an easy, simple way of taming a Caro. Or you can just tame one the traditional way. It's really not that difficult whatsoever, and once you have one, they are a carnivore that can deal loads of bleed damage and just generally have quite a nice amount of mobility and quite a nice size as well. You can be pretty stealthy on a Caro, and although yes, maybe their footsteps are a bit louder than you might expect, you can be reasonably well hidden with a Caro, which maybe something like an aloe or something larger than that, you would struggle a little bit, because you know, Rexes kind of stick out a lot more than a Caro. Caros just, they're a little bit more reserved, and I like them for that. They're a good bridge between something like a raptor and an aloe. It's just, they're such useful creatures, I find, and I use them tons and tons all over the place. And I find people really discount these creatures for creatures like aloes, like I've said before, and I kind of find that's a shame, because I think these really do stand by themselves for being really great creatures. And obviously because of that, I'm going to put them on this list, because I find that they definitely are undervalued creatures, and I wish that people paid them a little bit more respect, as I think it is definitely well deserved. In at number 4, we've got the Yeti, and the Yeti isn't here just because people don't really use it. I find it's undervalued for its versatility, because people will just use these things in boss fights for that one case where you buff your creatures, and that's it. People won't use them for other things, and I find that is a huge waste of a creature like this, as they are capable of dealing tons of damage, and you can even just use them to fight bosses with, although that's not my preferred use. They're just really great carnivores that can traverse maps just quite easily compared to something like the Rex, and obviously they're kind of better than aloe in some ways and all of that, and obviously then you can debuff creatures. They just work really well as creatures to travel around the map with, and you can even do meta runs and things like that. And I know that seems a little bit far-fetched for some people, but I find they are just really great creatures for that. And obviously the RG is going to be better for meta runs because it's a flying creature. Still, you could do quite a lot with something like a Yeti apart from just use it for fighting bosses. And I want to know, what do you use the Yeti for apart from in bosses, because I'm not too sure if there's many people out there that use the UT for many other things apart from that, and that's why I think it's undervalued. I don't think it's undervalued as in people don't use this creature or care about this creature, because they do, but it's undervalued for its versatility. In at number 3, we've got the Gasbags, and this creature is here just because I find it can just be a really useful Ark creature in general, and people don't really use it. And yes, there is a bit of a learning curve, and by the time I recorded this B-roll, I really wasn't great at flying this thing, but now I'm quite a significant amount better. I'm not going to say I'm a god at flying this thing, but I can actually get it to kind of move where I like. So I do excuse in advance my quite terrible Gasbag flying, because yeah, I really did not do a great job with this B-roll. I have to re-record it at some point and, you know, get it all looking like I can't know that I can fly the Gasbag instead of I can't. But either way, these creatures insanely useful just as a general tank as well. If you puff them up, there's a lot of damage reduction, and obviously great for doing meta runs and things like that, because they've got tons of weight, and you don't even need a saddle to ride one. But if you do chuck the saddle on, obviously you get extra armor and another player can join you. So it's actually quite useful if you have friends in the Ark world, and you know, you might want to bring them along with you for a meta run. And I know these are all quite basic uses for the Gasbags. I find people don't really use them as much, and I know the Maywing is like that go-to traveling mount, and you can just do a lot with the Maywing. I find maybe give the Gasbags a go if you have access to the Gasbags, because I find they're a little bit undervalued as a creature, and I find people can do a lot with Gasbags. It's just they don't really end up doing anything with them, and I find that's quite a shame, really. I wish people did actually use these things a lot more, because they just work so well in so many situations, especially for turret soaking and metal runs, to just name the main two that they use for. So yes, Gasbags, really undervalued creature in my opinion, and I hope that more people use this creature going into the future. In at number 2, we have got the Crystal Wyvern, and this creature is simply here because I find, compared to the normal Wyverns, these are extremely undervalued, and people have been saying that the Ember Crystal Wyvern is really a highlight for them. For me, it's the Blood Crystal Wyvern. Obviously, this I'm pretty sure is neither. It's just a Tropical Crystal Wyvern. They really are so useful, and a few people in my community have been saying yes, they definitely do really agree with this, and the general consensus is, oh, the Crystal Wyverns are just not as strong as Wyverns, but actually I find they're even more effective than all Wyverns, and that obviously does come from the fact that the taming method is a lot easier. Yes, it is capped behind level 60, and also you have to knock out one to get the Primal Crystal in the first place, but once you've done that, it's not really that difficult, and even that bit isn't difficult whatsoever. So, you know, these things are ridiculously easy to tame, and they're just such good creatures. They really do have to be on this list, because people extremely undervalue them, and I find that they need to be on this list because they need more attention. They really do deserve it. They are great creatures which are strong in all aspects, apart from turning circles, but you know, that's not great on the Wyvern anyway, and I just find they're so useful for so many things, even more so than the Wyvern, although they're kind of the same creature, although I do find these are better because they're just easier to tame, and there's a lot less of a lengthy process you have to go through to get them. I really do find they're extremely effective, and I wish people use these creatures more. And in at number 1, we've got the Blood Stalker, and this creature is here because I find, yes, people do use it for traveling and all of that. It gets a bit undervalued over the Maywing, and I find it can be really effective. Also, I do excuse my Bloodstalker flying. Really was not the best at flying it back when I recorded this B-roll, but I assure you I'm better now. And obviously I'm going to have to re-record those Gasbags and Bloodstalker B-rolls. I will add it onto my list of stuff to do, but also I find that these are the best ocean creature out there. I know they're not ocean creatures, but they're the best kind of dealing with the underwater environment in my opinion, and I didn't show any of that in this B-roll, which is another reason why I really do need to re-record it. Either way, these creatures are just so great at traversing underwater environments. They're so quick and speedy, and they can deal quite hefty amounts of damage as well, which you might not expect. And maybe you're not going to take it to do alpha creatures, but you can just easily zip away from them. Also, on top of that, they can glide on the top of the water as well, so kind of just to escape danger even more, you can just simply skim across the top of the water and get out of the way of all of those creatures that are trying to attack you. And also on top of that, you kind of do have like an awesome spyglass, but without the need for an awesome spyglass, so you can see the aggros of all the creatures. Extremely useful, especially in an underwater environment when the visibility isn't quite as great great is obviously just on land. So I do find they're extremely useful for everything like that as well. And obviously if you're on Gen 1, you can warrant loads and loads of use out of these things. They're kind of like rock drakes in that sense. They are like a creature which you essentially really have to use for that purpose. So yes, in my opinion, the Bloodstalker is the most undervalued creature for what I think it could do. I just find people don't use it for that, and that's why I put it in at number 1.
And give it up for our patrons, Ekaterina Puchkova and Karina Thorne, Dominic Macy, sorry about that name, and everyone else that's on this list. All the people I've mentioned are paid members, and if you feel like that's something you want a shout out at the end of the video, go join the Patreon or become a paid YouTube member.